Well, welcome back and welcome to the second and final session today about the current policy challenges in space. I'm Steve Hadley. I'm a principal of Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manual, and a member of CFR's Board of Directors. I'll be presiding over this session today. We have two participants. We're joined today, of course, by an audience here at CFR and online. Our participants today are Charles F. Bolden Jr., who should be coming up virtually with us today. He is the founder and chief executive officer emeritus of the Charles F. Bolden Group. He's a former administrator of NASA from 2009 to 2017. He's a former astronaut and a CFR member, and he'll be speaking virtually. There he is, connected with him. Terrific. We're going to put him up here. Terrific. Charles, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Glad to be with
secondly, we have Ezinne Uzo-Okoro, who is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, a venture partner in Sinewave Ventures, a former assistant director for space policy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and welcome, and thanks for being with us here this afternoon. So I'm going to begin with a couple questions, and then we will, after about a half hour, go to questions from the audience. And I want to start with a fairly general question that is talked about in the report, and that is this: how should we think about space? Is it another domain like land, sea, air, and cyberspace where the major powers are going to compete diplomatically, economically, and militarily? Or should we, as was suggested in the report, see it as part of the global commons that should somehow be shared, free from great power competition? And if it's the latter, let's be honest here, is this really realistic to talk about space as a global commons, given the level of competition between the United States and China and Russia? And let me, Charles, if I may, let me start with you. How do you think about this idea of global commons? Is it just pie in the sky, or is there some potential here?
No, I don't think it's pie in the sky at all. And watching the first session, I think some people may have gotten the impression that space is only for national security and the like. But my belief is that having opened up space to commercial entities, having one commercial entity in particular be the dominant player in space today in civil and commercial space, it's got to be opened up to everybody. The problem, as Ezinne and I will probably discuss, is there is no governing body right now that that controls the global common. So it's almost like the Wild Wild West, in my opinion.
Ezinne, what do you think?
Well, thank you, Steve, for having me. And I do agree, it is a global commons, but I think that we have reason to be optimistic. We have an agreement with Russia to manage and operate the International Space Station that has been going strong for decades. And this is through lots of sanctions that our country has placed onto Russia, and this partnership continues. And so if we can partner with a nation state like Russia through all of these national security challenges and sanctions, then I think that there is room for us to, or I believe there is room for us to share space and collaborate. There are lots of low-hanging fruit, which I hope we get into, in areas of debris management and astronautic exchanges and lunar study. But there are opportunities for us to work together while being a strong strategic competitor against other nations.
Let's delve a little more deeply into that, and let me go back to Charles. Can you talk a little bit about how the cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union got started in the Cold War? How extensive has it been? And why has it endured and survived despite the remarkable tensions now in the relationship between Russia and the United States? And what lessons can we draw from that?
Steve, you're going
That's
to
what you
date.
call a compound question,
Yeah,
Charles.
you're going to date me here. And some of it's going to be from memory, and the other is going to be from conjecture. But the collaboration between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, as Russia used to be, began in earnest with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. We were looking for a way to see if we could work collaboratively with our other back then peer competitor, if you will, in space. And we put together the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where an Apollo spacecraft carrying 3 of our crew members and a Soyuz spacecraft carrying General Alexei Leonov and his crew linked up on orbit and became lifetime friends. We decided later on, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, President Clinton actually decided that we were working on this thing called the International Space Station. And Russia was not a part of the organization of the International Space Station at the time. But in my opinion, he was smart enough to know that if we left them to their designs, their scientists and engineers would go all over the place and probably to some pretty bad places. So we were instructed to reopen the negotiations on the International Space Station and make the Russians a partner, which we did. And that's what Esneh is talking about now. That was quite some time ago, and we ended up flying a few shuttle missions. One in particular was my last mission, which was the Flight 1 in Phase A of the Shuttle Mir program, where we wanted to see if we could, in fact, work collaboratively with the Russians. It turned out we did incredibly well. We moved from that to flying American astronauts on Mir 6 times. That worked out relatively well, and then we moved into the International Space Station, which is where we are today. So I think we've demonstrated that we can work with just about anybody. We'll talk more, hopefully, about the Wolf Amendment, because that's the fly in the ointment right now. And I think when we get to that, we'll understand a little bit about what can be done. I share Esneh's optimism, but I guess that's enough for now.
Esneh, do you draw any additional lessons from the cooperation with Russia that might apply to China?
Yes, a few. And I think that we need to, unfortunately, separate national security space, commercial space, and civil space to get to the crux of this. On the national security side of things, we are asking the question about deterrence. But we need also to be asking the question about de-escalation and what that looks like. And there's an opportunity to collaborate with the Chinese on de-escalation approaches and methods. In the commercial space arena, we've got lots of examples in other sectors of the US companies collaborating or manufacturing in China. Our iPhones, some of our vehicles. And in space, we don't necessarily need, the US government does not necessarily need to determine what that collaboration looks like, but there needs to be some kind of opportunity to give US commercial companies an edge, whether it's in collaborative agreements that they see is necessary with the Chinese, or in creating more business opportunity, creating value as they, for instance, supply things to the Chinese space station. And then on the civil side of things, while we have a trust issue with China currently because of the Wolf Amendment, while leverage, as was mentioned in the last panel, is an approach, we also need to talk about respect, because as the second largest nation in the world, or the second global power in the world, what does China deserve? And I can say this now, being outside of government, but don't they deserve some amount of collaboration with us that is respectful? For instance, not just the human safety accomplishments we made in the last administration in communicating with the Chinese, but perhaps an earnest invitation to the International Space Station so that we may also receive an invitation to the Chinese space station. Perhaps it's the respectful exchange of lunar data, because the Chinese have been to the far side of the moon twice now, and we have not, and our academics don't have access to that data. And it's important in those three areas. You know, we have one space, and at the White House, as someone who went in being a civil space expert, I came out having spent most of my 3 years mostly on the national security side of things because of a lot of scenarios that just really needed all hands on deck, and where we saw that what was happening in the civil space and the commercial space really needed to align with what was happening in the national security space. So as we move forward, as one big sector that continues to grow and continues to mature, I think that we do need a new approach to, a new and bold approach to our relationship with China. I think it's possible.
I think
Steve,
you've
can I-
spotlighted.
Steve, can I have
Sorry.
one to what Esne
Yes,
said?
please, Charles. Yes.
At the risk of starting a war here with a verbal war with some of the audience, I hope Professor Scott Pace is either in the audience there with you or online or something, because he and I are friendly adversaries about engaging with China. And he will, I think Scott will say that China has to do something to earn our respect. Well, going back to what Esne said, the Russians didn't do anything to gain our respect. We just needed their help. We wanted to keep their scientists and engineers from going to bad parts of the world. And so we found a way to bring them in. That's the way that we were trying to do in the Obama administration, to bring China in. But there were voices that said, but they haven't done anything to earn their way in. We can continue with this argument if we want to in perpetuity, but we're not going to get any closer to making space this common ground for everyone that's relatively safe. We'll never be safe, but relatively safe for all to operate, particularly commercial entities.
It seems to me one of the issues that has surfaced is, can we distinguish with respect to China between cooperation which would pose national security concerns and cooperation which would be purely civil and commercial? And I'll give you two anecdotes. On the Russia side, there was a time, I think someone here from Lockheed Martin was buying RD-180 engines from Russia that was going on our space vehicles. And after a while, the Congress of the United States, in its wisdom, thought that was a national security risk because it was a dependence that we should not brook. So we began to make this distinction between national security cooperation, which we would rule out, or national things that put national security at risk, from cooperation in the space station, which seemed not to do so. The question is, can we do the same thing with China? And I'll give you one anecdote. Mike Griffin, who was then the NASA administrator when I was National Security Advisor, was going to China. And we coopered up a bold proposal for US-China cooperation in space, which we then ran through the interagency. And as you might expect, what got out of the Pentagon after the interagency process was about 2 very small and short paragraphs, because the argument was that manned exploration by the Chinese was part of their military structure, and therefore cooperation, we could not assure ourselves that cooperation and this, what seemed to be manned space, would not benefit them from a standpoint of national security and threats to the United States. I think the challenge is, can we make that distinction with respect to China and identify things we could do with China in space that would not raise national security concerns? You've raised a couple very good ideas. The report talks about rescue of distressed astronauts on the moon or in space, talks about space management, talked about risk mitigation, conflict and de-escalation measures. All that's good. I want to see if we can talk about a little bit more. You talked about cooperation in terms of data exchange? Can we think about joint non-manned exploration? It's probably too late for a joint space station. It's probably too late even to talk about cooperation for the moon. But what about Mars? Do we go to Mars individually as nations, or do we go to Mars as a whole humanity? Is this out of the realm of possibility, do you think? SNA, over to you.
You know, it is within the realm of possibility for us to collaborate and going to Mars. It depends on what you're going there to do. If we obviously have conducted some scientific experiments to date there, but as we've seen with the return to the moon with the Artemis program that NASA continues to develop, there was an appetite across the world, not just to sit back and watch the US return to the moon and cheer us from the sidelines. Other nations wanted to be part of the mission. So we chose a Canadian astronaut as one of the 4 in the last administration. And perhaps the same is true for Mars. And other nations, as they continue to develop their space programs, starting new ones, join the Artemis Accords, may want to see the 2 largest powers of the world collaborate and going to Mars together. But I would bring it back to today and the opportunity that's in front of us. And that opportunity is for commercial space and really opening space for business. And by that, I mean ensuring that the Department of Defense is not the primary or the largest customer or client in space. How do we do that in low Earth orbit, which is closer to us through space debris management? We could collaborate with them in space servicing technologies, on remediation technologies for debris, on robotics, docking missions to their space station. So we may not be able to collaborate on a new space station, but why can't an American company that has docking and capture capabilities provide that service to the Chinese space station? It increases their value creation. It grows the space asset class as we know it, and then all of the dry powder, all the investments that are sitting on the sideline, the investors that are sitting on the sidelines will then have a reason to, or have a greater reason to invest more in space when they see more, and not just more, but more creative and more innovative approaches to value creation in space.
Charles, building on what SNA said, do you have your own pet areas of potential cooperation?
My SNA smiling because she knows this really gets me excited. You know, I think we're losing a great opportunity for commercialization of space if we choose to eliminate I mean, how do you, going back to the Wolf Amendment, Congressman Wolf's philosophy was we can isolate China, you know, until they come around to seeing human rights the way we do. He and I respectfully disagreed on that, and I disagree on it today with anyone who says we can isolate China from commercial interest in space. Their companies, their society in general has, we need them to help us to do things like pharmaceuticals development, materials processing, the kinds of things that we do right now on the International Space Station. We have a new space station that could be available for use in Tiangong. Heaven forbid we even give consideration, as SNA said, to putting American entities on Tiangong so that they can do microgravity research. We might be surprised at what opens up when we do that and build a sense of trust between the 2 nations outside of national security. We've got to have the ability to think in a nuanced way where we can divide national security, not divide it, but we can put national security in the back of our mind while we do commercial and civil development. We've worked with the Chinese in science. We continue to work with the Chinese in science to a limited extent because we always get back to this trust issue. Getting samples from the Chinese samples that came back from an asteroid or the moon or wherever, it's encumbered by NASA and American scientists through NASA having to comply with the stipulations of the Wolf Amendment, whereas other nations in the world just get stuff from China. They just get information and get samples. We've got to change the way we operate there.
Let's move a little bit from China to commercial operators and private parties active in space. We talked about the need for, and the report talks about the need for an international space traffic management system. Can that really be developed without the participation of the private sector? And how would the private sector then participate in the development of what a lot of people would think is a governmental or international structure? Isn't you want to step up to that one?
So that system is very important for obvious reasons, but I think that we have multiple analogies in space of systems like that that are consequential, that are critical, like the International Space Station. It wasn't all, at least the American portion, wasn't all built at NASA by NASA civil servants. We had a whole army of you could call them primes, contractors, and commercial American companies that contributed to the development of not just the International Space Station, but frankly, every space system, both on the civil side of things and on the national security side of things. And there is an increasingly big push, I wouldn't even call it a nudge, but a big push to integrate more commercial innovation into government. And the government is willing and looking at not just on space security and in civil space, but even within the intelligence community, there is a friendliness and an openness towards commercial innovation. And I think that we all need to continue to develop that further and continue to encourage that and empower these companies to help us meet the mission. I don't see us continue to develop our enduring capabilities without the commercial sector.
So you're saying in terms of the International Space Station, the private sector has already been involved substantially in the development and the construction of the space station. Are there other ways in which the private sector can be involved particularly in the writing the rules of the road to space that we talked about in the report? Charles?
Yes, and I think, if you look at the report, we talk about several entities that are needed, and I think when you look at, I'm not a fan of a National Space Council. However, it can achieve some of the goals that are laid out in our report when we talk about bringing commercial, industry, entrepreneurs, government together to decide what the rules are going to be for moving forward. A frustration, if you talk to people who were on the National Space Council during the Biden administration, a frustration was from industry that there was a feeling that their inputs were not being heard or were not being entertained appropriately. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, because I have fortunately never been in the White House or in OSTP or anywhere else. I was peripherally involved as the NASA administrator. But I think, Steve, as you know, that is way outside the bubble that has great influence over the president. So I think you've got something like the National Space Council that can bring those groups in. The NSC is more along a national security need. So I would try to avoid overloading them with trying to manage commercial space. I've not been in the NSC. You've been around it. ESNA's been around it. I think that's one bite too many for something like the NSC.
I think that is a bit of an argument for the Space Council. I guess the worry I would have, and we're going to go to questions from the audience now, the worry I would have is that the rules of the road, in fact, if not crafted carefully, will start impinging on the innovation and flexibility that has allowed the commercial space companies to really be the primary moving forward of our space activities. We don't want to lose that under the name of creating government-centric rules of the road. So a real operational and implementation task that needs to be addressed as we go forward in this area.
Steve, if I may add,
Yes, please.
one of the difficulties and the beauty of intergovernmental policy creation, which I went through at OSTP, we had about 10 policies on space over 3 years, is that it's a shared responsibility across several departments and agencies. And while coming to consensus is difficult, there really is an advantage to having that shared responsibility and shared interest across several departments and agencies. The FCC can tackle the spectrum access issue and bring insights that NASA isn't thinking about. NASA doesn't have to bear the weight of every civil and commercial space issue. The Office of Space Commerce can take up some of that within the Department of Commerce, the Space Force, the Air Force, the FAA. So it just, I think that there is a lot of advantages to having multiple stakeholders across the government and not just a small body within the Executive Office of the President.
A strong case for the interagency system, the much maligned interagency system, I might add. Thank you, SNA. I'd like to, at this time, invite participants from those here in the audience in Washington and also those online to join the conversation. I think the plan is to go 2 questions from the audience, 1 online, right? All right, so let's begin. Yes, ma'am, right here in the center.
Thank you very much. Melissa Dalton from the Center for Strategic and International Studies and former Undersecretary of the Air Force. I actually wanted to return to one of the important questions from the prior session in terms of the role of counterspace capabilities when we think about deterrence. And in this broader policy conversation that we're having in this session, former Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, is on the record in December advocating for further investment in counterspace capabilities. We've also seen the Trump administration issue its executive order calling for the Iron Dome for America to include space-based interceptors. There's a clear bipartisan advocacy in terms of the need to invest in counterspace capabilities going forward. And so the question that I'd like to invite our speakers to perhaps offer some thoughts on is, how do we need to provide policy parameters around the role of these weapons in terms of our deterrence objectives and outcomes that we're trying to pursue as part of a whole of government or integrated deterrence approach, as was discussed in the last panel? What are the right questions that we should be asking in terms of how we should be employing these weapons? Can we? There are some important technical and sensitive details about the weapons specifically that certainly we need to keep in appropriate classified channels. But I think there's some really important questions that we need to feel comfortable putting on the table from a policy perspective, from a crisis communication perspective, and from an escalation management perspective. Thank you.
That's a lot to chew on. Charles, you want to give a start, an initial chew, if you will?
My initial chew would be when we start talking about counterspace weapons, we're talking about our break the glass action. It's hinted in the report. Well, it's not hinted. We talk a lot about proliferation of debris in space. If we're going to focus our efforts on counterspace weapons, we're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about, at what point do we give up and we decide that we're going to deploy a kinetic weapon, as an example, or a nuclear weapon? Because at that point, we have now shut down this area that we so value and so want to use for commercial development, because it now becomes unusable by most people, particularly low Earth orbit.
I'm old enough to remember the year of brilliant eyes and brilliant pebbles.
Brilliant
with some
pebbles,
of the
exactly.
audience.
Yep.
That was when space was relatively empty. It's pretty crowded up there now. I'm not quite sure how this is all
It's
going to
easy.
sort out.
It's very easy to talk about counter space unless you're somebody who wants to be able to travel in it.
Is it name?
I think that we have, start with the positive here. There is continuity in government across administrations in space. Trump 1 put out a vision for orbital debris. For instance, Biden implemented that strategy, which resulted in, I think, a NASA economics report that has been mentioned. And Trump 2 looks to have a strong interest in space as well. And you could do this going back several administrations. So on the policy side, this is a brilliant question for a classified session, I have to say. But in this forum, I would say that, you know, the questions about a deterrent assessment, the questions about a de-escalation approaches or methods, questions about how we continue to achieve our mission using enduring capabilities that either are developed or have yet to be developed. And then most importantly, on the policy side, ensuring that the executive office of the president also shares the value surrounding how much is at stake, because I think that really helps to determine how high of a priority this is, which is why we start our report with the recommendation to make space a top priority, because different presidents would have different approaches and different priority levels to different issues. And we'll stop there for this session. Great question.
Great question. Maybe a subject for another task force report. I don't know.
That's
We'll have
right.
to talk to Michael. Other questions here? Yes, ma'am. Front table here.
Hi, Lauren Williams again. A little bit of a comment and then mostly a question, but I wanted to go back to the point on private sector engagement, I think in foot stomp as an and Mr. Bolden's points about engaging the private sector. But the point that I would make is that I think private sector has to be the leading edge of how we kind of think about as government stakeholders shaping policy on space. And I think maybe in recent decades, we've thought the civil space or national security operators have the monopoly on those issues, but we've really got to engage. And so the question would be how both of you might see the Trump administration demonstrating kind of the open door or open ears to the private sector to come in and provide their perspectives on shaping policy. One of the things that I learned in the White House, including as a contemporary of Ezene's there, is that the White House, and this is kind of gets to the National Space Council or whether National Security Council or other policies, when they call CEOs or they call senior executives, they will come to the table. And so that convening power is a really important kind of carrot that the White House does have. That said, you've got to make sure that you've got the other governmental stakeholders in the rooms, that there can be staying power and not just kind of meetings, but that we're driving toward policy outcomes. So I'm curious if either of you have ideas as to how the current administration can kind of right out the gate make sure that private sector stakeholders know that there's an interest in having private sector perspectives kind of be the leading edge of policy.
Isn't it?
I mean, his choice in advisors has shown us that there is an interest in private sector support and private sector advancement. So, and all I will offer positively about that is that as someone who was an ex-Navy official said to me, rising tide lifts all ships. So we must look at the involvement of these outside external advisors positively. And these external advisors have interests in space, but they also have, at the end of the day, business interests, which take us back to how do we not only create more opportunity for these companies to have value creation and make money, but also how do we ensure a more efficient government partnerships and commercial integration into government. Our budget for this year, the federal budget for this year, 849 billion has yet to be passed. And and this is why our report highlights OMB as the source of accountability and responsibility when it comes to, determining where resources should go. But with that large defense budget that is likely to grow to $1 trillion in less than 2 years, it's an opportunity. Well, one, it highlights one priority for the nation. But in terms of space, it really shows that we have an opportunity to innovate, that the private sector really is getting closer to a point where we can see leadership, not just in innovation, but in policy. And I'd admit this as an ex-policymaker, it's okay not to have the answers, and it's okay to convene CEOs to the White House. But more importantly, I think that it's solutions that they bring to the table based on the hard work that these companies are doing, not just for their company, but for the sector. And there were some examples of companies, space companies, who came to the White House and brought solutions that not only supported their company's mission, but helped to elevate and grow the sector. And I think that that's really important.
Under this administration, I wonder whether the president is going to convene a meeting and invite various CEOs and private sector companies, or Elon Musk is going to convene a meeting and invite representatives of various government agencies. Either way, they will both get in the room. Charles, how do you think this is going to sort out?
I want to be careful. I have very strong feelings here, and having served as a member of the user advisory group of the National Space Council, recently deconvened. That was built for CEOs to have their say, to contribute to the discussion. And it did not take very long for CEOs to stop coming, because I am not in a position to speak for them, but my impression as an insider trying to be an outsider was they felt that nobody really wanted to listen. So why spend my valuable time doing this? If we're going to convene such a group as Esene and I have been talking about, we also have to recognize the fact that many of the people who have some of the best ideas are not big companies. They're entrepreneurial upstart companies that have incredible ideas about things like orbital debris remediation and removal, on-orbit rescue, perhaps even have some ideas to help us in the area of crew rescue. Those ideas will probably come from some small unknown company right now, but they've got to be given an equal opportunity at the table. And you cannot have a meeting convened with the president where it's only, again, being careful here, it's not only buddies or cronies or whatever, but it's got to be the portion of industry and academia who have demonstrated by their performance that they have something to contribute.
Thank you. Good answer. Yes, sir. Okay.
Good afternoon. Che Bolden. I am the eldest offspring and the successor to one of your panelists. My question.
You recognize this guy?
I'm leaving.
It'll come as no surprise to one of your panelists and probably not the other, because we've had these conversations as well. This conversation tends to be overcome by the national security piece. I was the one that chirped in his ear before he got on and mentioned that piece. Commerce has always been the unifying factor in America for quite some time. It's also a unifying factor of the world. What considerations did the task force take into the commerce side of matters? Because space, like every other domain, is a dual use domain. It's not a domain of security. What kind of conversations do you all have around the commerce piece, and how do you get more small businesses, entrepreneurs, startups involved, like say maybe through a new form of a small business innovation research fund that is not limited to just American citizens or whatnot? Have you thought about that, or did you talk about that at all?
We did. I mean, one of the recommendations is about involving commercial companies and relevant non-government actors into not just policy discussions, but again, in the growth of the sector. And we can't streamline regulation without commercial companies, large and small. I will say, though, about visits to the White House, if you are a small startup, I was always surprised in my 3 years when a small startup with 3 people, and they came over to the White House for a 30-minute meeting, 20 minutes after pleasantries have been exchanged. And it's a long way to travel, and it's a lot of resources that these small companies don't have. However, given how small the sector is, I do think that we are still at a place where what most of the larger companies advocate for eventually benefit the smaller companies. Take the launch sector, for instance. Most of the innovations and the advances for commercial crew and cargo launches has really helped the small launch companies that launch smaller cargo. And there are other examples in robotics and advanced manufacturing in space. But we need to ensure that someone is at the table, someone from the commercial side is at the table helping, because most of our policymakers, I think, would really benefit from the view of what innovation is at stake, what's the budget required, and what does the private sector need from government to help push the innovation forward for us to continue being that preeminent leader in space. And the report does go into these cooperative attempts, not just with the private sector, but also with international bodies, as has been discussed in the previous panel.
Charles?
I don't have anything to add to what Esene just said. I think that's critically important, everything she just said.
It seems to me we've highlighted the importance of broad participation from small companies, startup companies, perhaps also the university sector, and in the report that Nina talked about, to do an assessment of vulnerabilities and means of remediation. One of the things we did is tried to describe a broad participation in that study work that would not make it simply government, but would reach out to the private sector, but also the university sector and other large companies, small companies, really get a diverse mix in that assessment process. And that's one of the ways in which we tried to address the issue you raised. Other questions? Sir. And then you back there.
Sam Visner with the Aerospace Corporation. I also serve as chair of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and I was a member of the task force. Thank you very much, by the way, for your service on this. I just wanted to swing back to the last question. There are some mechanisms by which the private sector, large companies and small companies, are working on some aspects of the problem. The Space ISAC works on the security and resilience of space systems. And we have a large membership of both large and small companies, including startups. But from the beginning, we opened the ISAC to global partners, to U.S. allies and partners, countries that share our values. So Japan, the UK, France, Israel, Taiwan, Greece, Germany, Australia, et cetera, have all partnered, and we have commercial members in several of those countries. And I'm pleased to say that the U.S. government has been broadly, tacitly, and in some cases explicitly supportive of the global aspect for at least space systems security. So there is, I think, an avenue to, a building block on which we can make further progress in building both international cooperation with countries that we regard as allies and partners, and bringing in the private sector, including smaller businesses and startups that have very innovative and very powerful ideas. Thank you.
Could you repeat the name of that organization?
Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's one of the information sharing and analysis centers that were set up for critical infrastructure protection.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Emily Matson, Georgetown University and the George Washington University. So my question related to the concept of frontiers in general in previous legislation regarding the polar regions, which is still an area of great contestation, as well as, the sea, whether it's, contestation over UNCLOS or the less known governance of the deep sea. So I'm wondering if there are any areas of overlap or any areas of preceding legislation that you have drawn on in considering the space region as, an additional frontier. Thank you.
Charles, you want to take a crack at that?
My memory is horrible, but we talked considerably about other types of conventions or treaties or groups that might be applicable to the work that we were doing, but I don't have any specific ones that I would add at this particular time.
Is the name?
I would say that Esther has her hand raised, and she is better equipped to answer this on behalf of the team.
Esther, you're on.
Just to jump in on that point in particular, that yes, that as part of the research, that we actually looked at other domains. And so that the example I think is actually the Treaty for Biodiversity on National Jurisdiction. That is a high seas treaty, which the United States has signed but not yet ratified.
It was years in negotiation, and some of the terms in that I think are very interesting for space. And so as we look forward to the work at CFR, Mike, one of the things I'll be doing is actually a book that's looking at some of the lunar issues and draws on some of these issues. So great question. I think something where all expertise of many of the people who follow this and look at different domains will be relevant. Thanks for the question.
I have to add that we also went through the pros and cons of this approach, because as you know, you could lead with your own policy as a nation. You could lead bilaterally with another nation and multilaterally. And some of these multilateral fora do take quite some time. The Outer Space Treaty, we discussed how some might use the term outdated, yet we need it. But how do we update it when it's difficult to get consensus today? So it's obviously a complex and nuanced topic, but we have found, thankfully, other avenues, like with anti-satellite tests, to lead by example and bring other nations forward.
I've neglected our online audience, so if we have questions, let's take 2 questions online, and then we'll take one from the audience and wrap up.
We'll take our next question from Stephen Flanagan.
Hi, thank you all for a very interesting discussion. I'm Steve Flanagan, a senior fellow at RAND. I wanted to offer a personal observation on the value of having separate streams of oversight and coordination at the White House for national security and civil and commercial space separately. And in 2013 to 15, I was senior director for defense policy at the NSC. We had responsibility or chairing the Interagency Policy Committee on National Security Space, and we shared responsibility on some aspects of civil and commercial with the Office of Science and Technology Policy at that time. And I have to say, looking back on that, I think that synergy of having those two, and I of course, I was very fortunate to have as my director for space the gentleman who became then the executive secretary of the National Space Council, Chirag Parikh. But I think we valued tremendously in the NSC dimension. I'm interested to hear Esme's perspectives of having that additional perspectives working both ways. Not only that we could bring in some national security considerations into some of the commercial issues like space, some of this other civil issues like space traffic management, commercial imagery regulation, et cetera. But also that we were getting a perspective of the civil space considerations in some aspects of national security policy. So I think inevitably national security policy dominates, as was evident in some of the earlier discussion. But I think that it was important to have the benefit of the civil oversight mechanism for dealing with some issues like space traffic management and commercial imagery regulation that otherwise would have slipped lower on the national security priorities. We're focused on counter space. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Steve, very much. Next question from the online audience.
We'll take our next question from Caitlin Poling.
Hi there, Caitlin Poling with the State Department's Office of Space Affairs. I have a question and a comment, and I'll start with my comment. So our office leads the delegation to the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And I just wanted to flag up, since the conversation was on global STM, that there is an ongoing effort to tackle this at UN COPUOS. And we definitely work to incorporate private sector advisors. We put out a Federal Register notice, and we also do pre and post meeting briefs to make sure that we're, including the views of the private sector in the U.S. positions that we put forth at these meetings. We could definitely probably, do a better job in outreach and certainly welcome any suggestions offline. UNUSA is also trying to convene the private sector more. Director Artie Halamini has started the UN Space Bridge events. That was, I believe, an event that Jane and Esther attended ahead of last year's COPUOS. But one obstacle we do have is Russia and some other malign actors are working to prevent private sector involvement on a broader basis in UN COPUOS. So just wanted to share that context. But my question is going back to China and the recommendation that Esme had, and I'm just curious, how do export controls and the protection of IP factor into your recommendations on China about cooperation on space stations or commercial ties? You had cited iPhone manufacturing components in China, but there are some national security concerns about that. So is it prudent to send American space companies into China? Thank you.
No one advocated sending American space companies and Americans into China. We do have trade agreements in other sectors, and it would behoove us to consider what trade agreements in the area of space could look like. And it doesn't mean that it's not a complex issue and that there aren't nuances. We're not going to resolve them all during this session. It behooves us to be open to cooperation in some areas.
In a way, Charles, please go ahead.
I was just going to say the agreement that we made with Congressman Wolf in the early days of the Wolf Amendment that allowed us to work with China bilaterally was, that the intelligence community, we met with them to discuss everything we were going to discuss or have consultation. We listed every single participant from China by name. So that the background investigations could be done. And then we went into consultation and came up with things like China's involvement in Severe, a program, mainly hosted by the U.S. Agency for International Development, but the data for that program for disaster planning and relief, for water resources management, those kinds of things is provided by NASA. Or looking at geodetics, studying earthquakes, those kinds of areas we worked with until we stopped. So it can be done. We have to be nuanced. We can walk and chew gum.
At the same time.
At the same time.
Last question in the back here, please.
Hi.
We'll take one more here.
I haven't heard Matthew Mandelberg from U.S. Department of Justice. We haven't heard a lot this morning about the emergence of mega constellations or cheaper access to space. And specifically, I'm wondering how there's not just the existing stock of assets that we have in space, and also thinking about the assets that China and Russia have, but also going forward, how quickly we could send up new things into space. So, and how that affects the strategic thinking here in terms of whether it's cooperating or wrecking space. If we're able to, repopulate our assets in space much more quickly than China or Russia, and they also have investments that they need to protect or that they're investing for the future, how do we think then about those strategic dimensions of cooperation or rivalry?
One thing, that's a great question. One thing that I noticed happened that the intelligence community was starting to do during my time at the White House was what I will call threat education to commercial space, because it's difficult for you to innovate if you want to be the government to be your customer and you have no idea what's really going on. And so do we need more of that? I'll give a nuanced yes. What form and shape should that happen? I'm not entirely sure. We need to assess how to share information with commercial American companies to help them help the U.S. government meet its mission. And none of these problems have straightforward solutions, but I think it's important that we continue to move in the right direction, continue pushing, because we may not be able to, a U.S. space company may not be able to receive satellite parts, for instance, a guidance navigation system from a Chinese company, but there might be, parts of another component that can be manufactured, maybe not in China, but in other nations, that will give, it's just any and all ideas that give the U.S. government, the U.S. commercial ecosystem, and the entire space enterprise and edge, I think should be explored.
Charles? Anything to add?
Just briefly, I would, I give the example of Orbital Science when it was founded by David Thompson, that brought us the current Cygnus cargo module that goes to the International Space Station. His unique approach was Russian rocket engine, Ukrainian rocket body, and a pressurized vehicle built by Italy. And that has become incredibly successful, minus the Russian rocket engines now, but still, it can be done and comply with regulations and requirements of not confidentiality, but classification and the like. It can and has been done.
We come to the end of our session. I want to thank you all for attending today, both online and in person. Please join me in thanking Charles and Ezinne for being part of this panel.
Thank you.